Your Excellencies, distinguished guests, and everyone joining today, a very warm welcome to you all. My name is Beth Hirschfeld, and I'm the President of the Canada-UAE Business Council. Thank you for joining us for this special webinar, The Historic Abraham Accords, the Path to Peace, and the Global Opportunity. Education is an important pillar in the work of the Canada-UAE Business Council, fondly known as the CUBC. The CUBC was spearheaded by the federal governments of the UAE and Canada to facilitate trade and business activity between the two countries. So we are delighted to have the UAE ambassador to the US, His Excellency Yusuf Al Otaiba, a key architect of the Abraham Accords, with us to discuss this significant agreement and its opportunities. There are many different aspects of the Abraham Accords to explore, including the geopolitical, economic, and cultural opportunities for the world and for countries like Canada. To cover them, this session will be broken into different segments, and we are pleased to welcome some special guests to discuss these different issues with Ambassador Al Otaiba. I will introduce these guests to you in due course during the session. Before we start with the formal content, I would like to say a few thank yous, as this webinar would not have been possible without the help of so many. A sincere thank you to Ambassador Al Otaiba and his superb team for all of their support and efforts in the lead up to this session. To the CUBC co-chairs, Musaba Al-Kabi and the Honorable Jean Charest for their ongoing guidance. You will be seeing Mr. Charest a little later in the program, but I would like to make a special thank you to Mr. Al-Kabi, CEO Petroleum and Petrochemicals for Mubadala's investment company, who, with his team, played an integral role behind the scenes to bring about today's session. Mr. Al-Kabi has been a champion for strengthening the relationship between Canada and the UAE, and we are grateful for his service. And to our always supportive partners, the Embassy of Canada to the UAE Embassy to Canada, the Canadian Business Council Dubai, the Canadian Business Council Abu Dhabi, the Canada Arab Business Council, and the Canada and UAE consulates, who played a key role in today and work every day to support trade between Canada and the UAE. And of course, to all of you, it is so exciting to see so much interest in this landmark agreement. Thank you to everyone online now, and for those who submitted questions in advance of this session. Although we may not be able to answer all of your questions, rest assured that we have used them to tailor today's discussion. On September 15th, the UAE and Israel signed the historic Abraham Accords, making the UAE the first Persian Gulf state to normalize relations with the state of Israel. This deal is historic for many reasons, not least because it offers the potential to unlock peace, prosperity, and security for the whole region. To many around the world, this agreement came as a bit of a surprise, but to those of us who have lived in the UAE, as I have for the past 6 years, this agreement seems completely in character with the UAE's modus operandi. The UAE is a true global hub, where residents from more than 150 nationalities live and work peacefully together. It is also the first country in the world to have a Ministry of Happiness, as well as a Ministry of Tolerance, in order to align and drive government policy to create social good and promote social cohesion. Despite the challenging circumstances of the global pandemic, the UAE's strong vision and forward planning has enabled it to continue moving forward, even if it sometimes feels like the world has shut down. In July, the UAE successfully launched its Mars-bound HOPE probe, making the Arab world's first interplanetary mission. In August, the UAE launched the first nuclear energy reactor in the Arab world in a move towards sustainable energy sources. And in September, the UAE signed the historic Abraham Accords. All this while taking a leadership role in the fight against COVID-19, both through ensuring uninterrupted food, supplies, and research in country, and providing PPE and other pandemic support to over 70 countries around the world. Canada and the UAE share many commonalities: a genuine respect for diversity and gender equality, a greener planet, and a world that is peacefully interconnected and full of hope. Though the UAE is a small country geographically, Through its forward-looking actions and its quiet diplomacy, it is playing an outsized role in the regional and international stage. So with that context, it's not totally surprising that the UAE signed the Abraham Accords. And with this agreement comes enormous opportunity, including for countries like Canada, who enjoy strong trade and investment relations with both the UAE and Israel, and which we look forward to exploring further today. So without further ado, I would like to introduce our first special guest, His Excellency Fahad Al Rakbani, the UAE Ambassador to Canada, who will introduce our guest of honor today and invite him to make some welcome remarks. After an illustrious private sector career that included leadership positions with Mubadala Investment Company and the Abu Dhabi Council for Economic Development, His Excellency Al Rakbani became the UAE Ambassador to Canada in 2018. And I will now pass the floor to him. Ambassador.
Thank you, Beth. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. It gives me great honor to introduce my friend and colleague, His Excellency Yusuf Al-Ateba. I tried to memorize his bio, but honestly speaking, I couldn't. So if you would allow me to read a few of Yusuf's accomplishments since he joined as the UAE ambassador to the United States of America in July of 2008. In his role, Ambassador Al-Utaiba enhanced the US-UAE relations. He played a critical role to facilitate the landmark US-UAE 123 Agreement for Peaceful Civilian Nuclear Energy Cooperation, which came into force in 2009. Since becoming the ambassador, bilateral trade between the US and the UAE has increased by over 70%, solidifying the UAE's position as the US largest trading partner in the Middle East and North Africa. UAE investments in the US expanded, and prominent US healthcare, education, and cultural institutions such as Cleveland Clinic, New York University, and the Guggenheim established new UAE branches. In addition, the UAE and US governments established a formal economic policy dialogue and cooperated on ways to streamline travel for Emirati nationals between the two countries. Ambassador Al-Utaiba also dedicates a great deal of time to promote inclusion and religious tolerance worldwide. He joined the board of directors for the Special Olympics and played a key role in the initiative to host the World Games in Abu Dhabi, the first Special Olympics World Games held in the Middle East and North Africa. In February of 2019, he supported Pope Francis' historic visit to the UAE to promote interfaith cooperation and foster peace and goodwill amongst followers of the world's religions. Previously, Ambassador Al-Utaiba served for 8 years as the Director of International Affairs at the Crown Prince of Abu Dhabi Court and the Deputy Supreme Commander of the UAE Armed Forces, His Highness General Sheikh Mohammed bin Zayed Al Nahyan. In recognition of his loyal service to the UAE and leadership to build closer ties with the US, Ambassador Al-Utaiba was promoted to the rank of Minister in October of 2017. Ambassador Al-Utaiba obtained a degree in international relations from Georgetown University in Washington, D.C. After graduating from the Cairo American College. He also attended the Industrial College of the U.S. Armed Forces at the National Defense University in Washington, D.C. as an international fellow. Ambassador Yusuf, it's great to have you with us, and we're privileged to have you and share your thoughts and experience since you worked closely on this historic Abrahamic Accord. So welcome to this webinar.
Thank you very much, Fahad. It's great to be with you.
Ambassador Yusuf, could you please shed some light into the timing and the importance of this accord? I mean, why now, at this specific moment? The world is going through, COVID 2019, a lot of, difficulties around the world. So what is important about this agreement?
Yeah, thank you. So that's one of the most popular questions we get. Why now? The second most popular question we got, and it was the 2 days following the announcement in August, spoke with 21 members of Congress. All 21 members asked, okay, who's next? Who's next? And this was before the Bahrain announcement. People sensed an enthusiasm and people wanted to know what was coming down the line. The truth is, we've been talking about normalizing or expanding or improving our relationship with Israel for a long time. We've had that debate internally in the UAE now for several years. And I think it's safe to say that we wanted to go in that direction. It is why you saw more Israeli athletes participating in sports competitions. It's why you saw an Israeli delegation team at the Special Olympics in March. It's why you're seeing an Israeli pavilion in Expo 2020 next year. All these moves were a deliberate strategy towards putting us on a roadmap or on a road towards normalization. Earlier in the summer, you started hearing a debate in the US and in Israel about annexation. Our conclusion was if Israel proceeded with annexation, it would make our goal of normalizing with Israel very challenging. There's no way in the region, public opinion, politics would support an Arab country normalizing with Israel after annexation. And so we concluded that we needed, in order to prevent annexation, in order to save the two-state solution, in order to prevent the region from going into this kind of tailspin that would be a result of annexation, we tried to come up with a way to avoid it. And so I wrote an article in the Israeli press, which was kind of something we had never thought of or never done before, in mid-June. And the article was very simple. It was said, hey, if you guys in Israel really truly believe, or you want a special relationship or a better relationship with Arab countries, you can't annex. You can't annex and expect to improve your relationship with Arab countries. It's really a choice. You have to make this choice, think carefully. It is definitely a sovereign decision. It is your call, but you can't do both. That happened in mid-June, and really in around early July, we started fairly serious conversations with the White House about how we can prevent annexation. And by the way, there were a lot of mixed views inside the US administration about annexation. It was not yes, no, there were different voices, and it wasn't a settled debate, but it looked like it was going to happen. So early July, we started having these negotiations, and we finally got to a place where, hey, would you trade normalizing with Israel in exchange for a commitment for no annexation? And once you got the premise down, we negotiated a few details, but basically within 5 weeks, we had a very simple, straightforward agreement. We would agree to normalize with certain conditions in exchange for a US guarantee and a US assurance that Israel will not annex. And so you came up with this very simple, very profound, but win-win outcome that was announced on August 13th. Everything else that you saw is a follow-up to that. You saw an American delegation bringing an Israeli delegation to the UAE to start talking about MOUs and bilateral agreements. Day before yesterday was an Emirati delegation in Israel concluding some of those agreements on taxation, investment, civil aviation. So you basically have the two countries now off to the races to set up the infrastructure, rules, legal arrangements to be able to trade, to be able to travel, to be able to invest, to be able to share technology. All that's already underway, and it's only been 2 months. So I think we're moving quite fast, but the agreement itself, one, was done in a very, very short period of time, and two, really came about because of the annexation debate in Israel.
Thank you, Yusuf. Yusuf, you mentioned a lot of history and the backs and forths that you've had with the American government and talking about the different options we have. Post the signing of this agreement, I mean, what importance does it bring for the UAE, Israel, and the wider region? And let's say for the youth, for example, I mean, what does it show them? What story can we tell here? How are they convinced with with this agreement? What do they think about it? Because I've seen some polls that talk about the views from the different sides of the on the Israeli front and the Arab front. So could you please elaborate a little bit on that?
Yeah. So I sent you yesterday 2 polls that basically what I concluded from those polls is the region is changing. The attitudes in the region are changing. The mindsets are changing. The things that we felt were important 10 years ago or 20 years ago, the young people in the Middle East don't feel are as important today. I sent it for a very simple reason. I wanted to share with your audience evidence, data, of what people think is important, of what people prioritize, of what people feel their challenges are. The part about identity in the Arab Youth Survey to me was fascinating. How people view their identity, whether it's the tribe or religion or their location. But the overall sort of takeaway from all of these things that we sent was the Middle East that most people think they understood 10 or 20 years ago is changing. And it's changing in a way that most people are not recognizing. So there's going to be a talk about the geopolitics and policy, Iran, Turkey, the two-state solution, Palestine. That's fine. And that's going to exist before or after the Abraham Accords. But the part that I'm most excited about and why I look at so much data to understand what it means for our young people and people like my 10-year-old son or my 7-year-old daughter is that there's going to be a completely new understanding. You know, my 10-year-old son is going to grow up thinking doing business with Israel is totally normal. He's never going, it's like young people not ever having seen a CD or a VHS tape. That's history, right? They're going to think this is normal. And maybe we don't solve every problem, but I think what we're going to do is create more opportunities, create more chances, create more jobs, create more economic output and trade. And I think that's good for the region. The part I'm most excited about, honestly, Fed, is we broke a taboo, a very long-standing taboo, and it turned out really well, right? In fact, let's rewind a year and a half ago, almost 2 years ago now, we invited the Pope to visit Abu Dhabi. First time a Pope ever visited the Arabian Peninsula, ever. And there's obviously a reason why it hadn't happened, but it happened and there was no backlash. There was no criticism. There was actually the opposite. People were very happy. People were very excited. I saw images of people lining up at 5 o'clock in the morning to go get into the mass in Abu Dhabi that had 180,000 people. So we broke a taboo when the Pope came, and look what happened. It turned out great. We broke another taboo by sending an astronaut to the space station. Great. We're sending a probe to Mars. We're breaking taboos that ultimately provide nothing but good news and hope and positive outcomes. And so I think making peace with Israel is another in a pattern of breaking taboos that the region is ultimately moving away from. So I think it's going to create hope. I think it's going to create jobs. I think it's going to create a positive outcome. I think it'll help us maybe move towards a two-state solution. I think the Abraham Accords definitely salvage a two-state solution, because if annexation took place, we would be talking today about a one-state solution and the consequences of annexation. So I think it definitely creates the space and puts time on the clock for better diplomacy, but ultimately it's going to be up to the two countries. But it really sends a really positive signal, I think, to the youth.
Thanks, Yusuf, for that. And, I have seen and I've witnessed the positive signals and the way this agreement has been received. No one, I think, expected this, how people were happy and how people, as you mentioned, Yusuf, this taboo has been broken. Like ever thinking that, why can't we deal with the other side? Yeah. There are a lot of benefits. We could still deal and disagree on some things. I mean, the important issue is to maintain this dialogue and to work together, because I've seen since the Abrahamic Accord has been signed, for example, Emirati and Israeli companies working together with regards to finding a solution for COVID. I mean, that's a good thing, not only for us in the UAE and Israel. If we succeed in finding a vaccine or a solution, I mean, that's a win for the whole world. That's good for humanity.
Absolutely. And there's some issues you just have to take politics out of.
Absolutely.
COVID is one of them. COVID, we've worked with Israel and the United States, we've worked with Syria and Iran, and we've worked with China. This has to be apolitical. This has to be to the advantage of human race, and that's it. And so we can be pragmatic on some of these things. And like you said, we haven't had a relationship with Israel for a very long time. And what did it deliver? It delivered nothing. Now we can have a conversation. We can agree on some things. We can disagree on some things, but that's what relationships are.
Sure. I mean, my last question to you, Yusuf, before I hand over to back to Beth, and I'm sure Marcy and John have a lot of questions for you, is about the the Abrahamic Accord talks about a strategic agenda for the Middle East. Could you please elaborate a little bit about that? And what's the strategy? In the accord, is there something specific? Are there countries included in this? To work around the strategy, or what is it, Yusuf?
So this is an open door for maybe like-minded countries, for a coalition of the willing. Are you willing to work with us on things that we are already working on tolerance, on culture, on tourism, on technology, on healthcare, education, and of course on security? We need to work to protect what we've built in the UAE. UAE now is the second strongest economy in the Middle East. We're only 10 million people and we're less than 50 years old. We're very proud of what we managed to build. So we will want to go to all lengths to protect what we've built. And we think the US role in the region is very important and it's critical. I think the US role brings stability to our part of the world. So anybody who wants to work with us on that basis, ahlan wa sahlan, you're more than welcome. So it's not defined into who's supposed to do it and what, but are you going with us in this direction? You're more than welcome to jump on board. And so it's an open invitation.
Well, that's all for my questions to you, Yusuf. Thank you very much for open-heartedly answering them. And Beth, I think the floor is yours now.
Thank you so much, Ambassador Al-Rakwani. I think that the two of you did a really wonderful job at setting the stage about the agreement, how it came about, and why it's so important. I'd now like to invite another special guest to delve into some of the details and the implications of this agreement. So please join me in welcoming the Honorable Jean Charest, who is the Canadian co-chair of the Canada-UAE Business Council. He will be discussing with Ambassador Al-Otaiba the geopolitical and economic opportunities arising out of this agreement. He needs very little introduction, but I'll give a very brief one. With a public service career spanning almost 30 years, the Honorable Jean Charest is one of Canada's best known political figures, having served in important roles such as the Deputy Prime Minister of Canada and the Premier of Quebec. He now serves as a partner at the law firm McCarthy Tétrault. Over to you, Mr. Charest.
Thank you very, very much, Beth, and thank you for your great work in putting this webinar together. It is quite an honor, Ambassador Al-Otaiba, to have an opportunity to meet you, and for all our guests today. We're very, very grateful that you have found time to join us. I want to acknowledge a few people. Our ambassador in the UAE, Marcy Grossman, is with us today. And also the co-chair. I want to take a moment just to thank Musaba Al-Kabi, who is my co-chair on the Emirati side, who really is the person who had the idea of putting this together. So Musaba is a good friend and a great friend, and thank you for that. And I also want to acknowledge Senator Percy Down, who's the co-chair of the Friendship MPs and Senator Friendship Association in Canada, and MP Faisal El Khoury, who are joining us today. And finally, I want to thank our good friend Fahad Al-Rakbani, who has had an extraordinary run as the ambassador of your country here in Canada and has accomplished a great deal. So your Department of Foreign Affairs has been outstanding. I mean, your track record is just extraordinary. So we're very lucky to have Fahad, and I'm delighted to join you today. Ambassador, you will know that the day after the signing of the agreement, our Minister of Foreign Affairs and Global Affairs, François-Philippe Champagne, put out a statement in expressing very strong support and a very warm congratulations for this agreement. I think it's fair to say that this agreement is one of the shining lights of the year of 2020, which will have been the year of COVID for all of us. But this agreement, we all have a sense, without any fear of exaggeration, that it is historic, and it marks a great step in the relationship between Israel and the other Arab countries of the region, but also for the rest of the world, as an example for the rest of the world. In the case of Canada, our relationships have warmed up a great deal in the last few years. Of cooperation, lifting of visas, which FAD was very involved in, involvement in Expo Now 2021, a whole host of more accelerated investment. We'd like you to give us a sense of what this could mean for a country like Canada, because we can't help but think that as other countries join in and give life to this agreement, the Abraham Accords between Israel and the UAE, that this would be, that there's an opportunity, an economic opportunity and a political one for us. So maybe you can give us a sense of how do you see, or what's your vision of the participation or involvement of a country like Canada in making these accords live on and find their full expression?
So just a quick disclaimer. I know I am very unqualified on the economic side. I think I slept through every economic class I've ever taken in college. So I'm not the business guy. If I was, I wouldn't be in government. But if you want to look at big picture, think of two very powerful, dynamic, forward-looking economies that until 2 months ago never worked with each other, economically speaking or politically speaking. They were kind of running in separate lanes, but they're running really fast ahead of the rest of the region. Now you can bring those two together and put them on the same team. So that unleashes incredible amount of potential on the economic side, on the science and R&D side, on technical issues, on things like AI. So my advice would be the same. I had a meeting with a senior executive from Google about 2 weeks ago, and he asked me the same question. He's like, what can Google do to spur innovation and cooperation between the two countries? I said, well, how can you bring young entrepreneurs together? You are Google. Whatever you do, people will kind of flock to you. So if you created an incubator in either country for both young Emiratis and young Israelis, people will do it. If you find ways to build bridges, economically speaking, in the sectors that we are looking at, and the sectors we're looking at are obviously technology, AI, agriculture and agritech, life sciences, biotech, pharmaceuticals. But of course, we're also looking at trade, tourism, cultural events. I'm laughing because when we started negotiating how many flights per week we'll have between our two countries, the first number we got from Israel was, you're going to get 10 flights per week. And we balked. I got a call from Abu Dhabi. They're like, Yusuf, we need your help. We need more flights. We have 6 airlines. We can't live on 10 flights per week. And my guys are telling me, we want a warm peace. We want tourism. We want trade. So there's this desire, there's this demand for more interaction, because Israel is this kind of uncharted territory for us politically, culturally, economically. And I think it's the same otherwise as well. So I think there's a lot of energy and excitement. Once the flights actually start rolling, I think there's going to be a lot of two-way trade, but just to get to know each other. But on the economic front, I would go to the sectors where the countries have a predetermined interest and predetermined strengths. So for Israel, it's technology, obviously, it's AI, it's agriculture and desalination. And for us, it's quite similar, very similar issues. Like desalination is very big for us. Agritech, food security. Our food security minister was the third call between our officials. That tells you how important it is for us. So there's a lot of opportunities. There are a lot of sectors where both countries have expressed their desire to do more. I would urge, folks in Canada of how to bring those two together. Could you arrange a Canadian business delegation that goes from Canada to Israel to UAE, or from UAE to Israel?
So a joint mission that under the umbrella of the Abraham Accords would probably be a very good idea, either doing Israel and the UAE together. I want you to expand a bit on something that was a concept that was raised a few times that not everyone is familiar with on the line, because it's relatively new. The difference between a warm peace and a cold peace, because it is part of the vocabulary of this agreement that makes it different. And the other thing I wanted you to get a bit ahead, Ambassador, to speak to, is that the UAE sees itself very much as a scale-up nation and a gateway. And that's significant for the deployment of this accord, and also where Canada would see opportunities. If it's a gate, if the UAE is a gateway and a scale-up nation, then that is something that I think we'd want to pay attention to. But please, first of all, just a moment to tell us the difference in concept of a warm and a cold peace.
So the cold pieces that exist in Egypt and Jordan exist for very valid reasons. Both of those countries have very tense relationships with Israel, have had histories of wars, have demographic issues because Jordan has a very large number of Palestinians. Egypt had wars in 67, 73, and finally the 73 war led to the 78 peace deal, which got them the Sinai back. So I grew up in Egypt, by the way. My mother's Egyptian. I was born and raised in Egypt. And I remember vividly that you grow up programmed thinking Israel's the enemy. It is not political or policy, it's just genetic. Israel fought wars with the Egyptians, and therefore you grow up thinking this is your adversary. It takes a certain level of maturity, I think, to then challenge your own preconceived notions. Why is Israel my adversary? And why should I believe that? And it isn't until you're much older, wiser, and you are able to question your own judgments until you can actually second guess why you have those views. So I think there are valid reasons why Jordan and Egypt feel that way. We have never fought a war. UAE has never fought a war with Israel. UAE doesn't share borders. UAE doesn't have a refugee issue that is caused by the Israeli-Palestinian challenge. And so those reasons don't exist in the UAE. You have a young, dynamic, forward-looking, pragmatic, and unideological demographic that looks at Israel as an opportunity. Hey, if there's a young Emirati who wants to do a startup, I'm sure he's researched the startup environment and sector in Israel. And I know for a fact, there's a lot of Israelis, including some in government, that have been dying to visit Dubai. And the thing they were most excited about after the Abraham Accords, someone said, "You mean I can go visit Dubai now?" And they said, "Yeah, you can go visit Dubai now." So there was this, it's like two people who wanted to meet but weren't able to. Finally, they're able to. That's very different from, I think, Egypt and Jordan because of the history. So I'm confident that not only will it be a warm peace, it will be a mutually productive and beneficial peace. The UAE is too small to be sort of a hub on its own. We have to scale up to be successful. Whether it's Dubai Ports World, Emirates Airlines, or banking and investment funds, you have to be a regional power. And this is just me thinking out loud with you. I haven't checked or even done any research on this, but let's say an Israeli company comes and sets up shop in one of our 32 free zones, either in Dubai or Abu Dhabi. Even countries that don't have a relationship with Israel, I don't see any reason why they can't do business with that company through a free zone in Abu Dhabi or Dubai, right? We can be the hub for doing business with Israeli companies through the UAE, even if those countries don't have an open relationship with Israel. I may be speaking out of turn, but I don't see the barrier for something like that.
Yes, Beth.
Sorry to interrupt, Mr. Shrey. We have a time for about one more question in this segment.
Well, I was just going to ask you as a last question on the Zogby poll that you referred to earlier, and the attitude of young people. You've already spoken to that. So, and it's an important part of the deployment again of this accord. So, public opinion, and especially young people, seem to be very strongly behind this. So, should we all in Canada, Israel, and the UAE looking at initiatives that target young people? Is that part of what we should do?
Absolutely. I think sometimes, we do things not understanding the public opinion support or the popular support behind it. But we poll on these things just to get a sense of where we are, where the country is, and what people like, what people don't like. I thought when I saw a certain number, they did ask one question in the UAE between 18 and 24-year-old Emiratis. They said, do you support or oppose the Abraham Accords? Personally, if you ask me without seeing the poll, I thought it would be between 60, maybe 70% support. Again, 18 to 24-year-olds. It was 89%. 89% of young Emiratis support the Abraham Accords. The second question was, do you support the same type of agreements with other countries? 91% support. So young Emiratis support other countries taking steps like the Abraham Accords just as much and actually more. It just shows you how there, I think some people, particularly in the Emirates, put ideologies behind them. They put Islamism, communism, all these isms behind them, and they're focused on opportunities. You know, if we do peace with Israel, I can do a startup project with an Israeli company, or I can go visit them, or maybe we can help them with the two-state solution. And look, those numbers are not the same in every country, by all means. But I think it's important to recognize the level of support that exists in the UAE. And then maybe a question for another panel is why? Why does that exist in the UAE and not every other country? But it's really exciting that we have this level of enthusiasm for something like this in the Emirates.
Well, Ambassador, thank you very much for your work and for your leadership and for offering us in the year 2020 something to remember that is going to actually change the world in a way that we all are going to be better off for. Thank you. Beth, back to you.
Thank you. And thank you for summing that up so nicely. I feel like now we can move on to the next segment with ease. It is my pleasure to introduce our next special guest, Her Excellency Marcy Grossman, to explore with Ambassador Al-Otaiba the cultural opportunities emerging from this agreement. Ambassador Grossman was appointed Ambassador of Canada to the UAE in 2019 after serving as Canada's Consul General for Dubai and the Northern Emirates from 2018 to 2019. And she was notably responsible for the creation of Canada's foreign direct investment agency, Invest in Canada. Ambassador Grossman, over to you.
Thank you, Beth, for your generous introduction. Remember I told you how nothing was going to go wrong tonight? I've been kicked off. I've been kicked off the line 5 times. So I'm going to hope that someone up there is watching my wired internet connection as I begin. So Ambassador Al-Otaiba, I just want to apologize in advance. You can blame Etisalat if you need to. So first of all, just good evening to everyone from Abu Dhabi. Bonjour, Canada, shalom, and salam alaikum. My sincere gratitude to the CUBC for leading this important discussion and for welcoming guests around the world. It's really my honor to share the virtual stage with my esteemed co-moderator, His Excellency Ambassador Fahad Al-Rakbani, my co-conspirator in this project that we're working on, and of course the Honorable Monsieur Jean Chéry. And to you, Your Excellency, Ambassador Al-Otaiba, Shukran Jazilan. Thank you so much for all you've done to bring us to this moment in time as one of the key architects of the Abraham Accords. And thank you for including Canada in this discussion and the making of history. So I'm going to actually take you back in time a little bit, because one of the questions I'm always asked when I tell people that I work in the UAE is, what's it like to work in the UAE? What's it like to be a woman working in the UAE? What's it like to be a Jewish woman working in the UAE? So I'm not going to ask you that specific question, but I'm going to ask you maybe to go back to your roots. I know when I got to the UAE, I was really surprised to see so many women represented as ministers. You talked about Minister Al-Muhairi just a second ago, Minister Al-Kabi. And there was also this very deep-rooted philosophies and messaging around coexistence and diversity and gender equality, but it wasn't just talk, it was action. And in the past 2 years alone, we've witnessed the Year of Tolerance, the visit of the Pope, as you've mentioned, the acknowledgement of the Jewish community of the Emirates, to which I'm very proud to be a founding member of, and the announcement of the building of the Abrahamic Family House. But I think to understand the importance of how we got here with the Abraham Accords is to really to look back and maybe share, if you could share with us, go back to the founding father, His Highness Sheikh Zayed, and tell us how it's really been part of the Emirati DNA over almost the last 50 years to hold these values. I think it would really help people to see the Abraham Accords as part of that legacy and what you can envision for the future. Thank you.
Thank you, Marcy, and welcome. I will definitely blame it Salat. Um, and thank you, because you kind of answered the question yourself. The question is, where did these values come from? Because the Abraham Accords, on or off, if we made peace with Israel in 2020 or in 2025, we were still going to build the Abrahamic house. We were still going to have kosher food. We were still going to be a tolerant and respectful and inclusive country, because we've always been. So I think the Abraham Accords put some of that into context for people who didn't already know it, because you've added values and interests and you've merged them together. But even if the Abraham Accords had not occurred, even if we didn't reach an agreement, we would still be doing everything you talked about. And it's like you said, it's because it's something we inherited from Sheikh Zayed. Sheikh Zayed was our founder. He was I don't know who the Canadian equivalent of is, but the American equivalent is George Washington, right? And he instilled these values in the country. He was not an educated man. He did not go to Harvard or Stanford or Yale. He was just very wise and very respectful and incredibly fair and incredibly non-judgmental is the best way to describe it. The one story that I remember hearing from Sheikh Mohammed was when Sheikh Zayed passed in 2004, November of 2004. The last couple of years, his health wasn't very good, but about early 2000s, I think he was in Switzerland, and he went for a walk, and he had a cane with him around that time. So there was a couple of shops where he was walking, and he would go into the shops, look around, see what's there, chat with the people, and then move on. And then as he was approaching one of the shops, the shopkeeper came out of the shop and almost like intercepted Sheikh Zayed and said, "Sheikh Zayed, it's very nice to meet you. Thank you for coming." But it looked and felt like he was trying to kind of brush Sheikh Zayed off and move him along. Like he was trying to help him not come into the store. Sheikh Zayed's like, "No, I want to come to your store." He's like, "No, Sheikh Zayed, I don't think it's a very good idea." He's like, "Why?" The guy felt very embarrassed. He went over to Sheikh Zayed, whispered in his ear. He's like, "Your Highness, I don't want you to be embarrassed. I don't want someone to see it. I don't want you to be humiliated." Like, "Why?" He said, "I'm Jewish. If someone takes a picture of you with me, it might cause you some issue. It might, be embarrassing." Sheikh Zayed said, "You're Jewish?" He said, "Yes, sir." Sheikh Zayed picks up his cane. He goes, "Get out of the way." Pushed him out of the way, walked into his store, sat in his store for the next 30 minutes, and gave him a talk about the relationship between Prophet Muhammad and his Jewish neighbors. I tell that
they
story,
kibitzed, as we say.
yeah, and I tell that story because there was no talk of Abraham Accords in 2000, and this is instinctively what our founder did. He doesn't separate religions. He doesn't judge based on who you are or where you're from. And I think that's how the UAE operates. Now, we were always like that. I don't think we took such a public and visible role on these things until recently. And when I'm asked why did we become more vocal about tolerance and moderation? The simple answer is because I think our religion has been hijacked. And if you ask any Canadian or American that has not traveled, that has not seen our part of the world, what they think of Islam, I think the first reaction will be something negative. Extremism, violence, terrorism, sectarianism, all these isms that put our religion in a very negative light. And so we feel that we had to take the narrative back, show the rest of the world that no, our religion is not extreme, it's not radical, it's not intolerant. There are just a few crazy people who take that approach and then ruin it for the rest of us. And so whether it's the Pope coming, or whether it's the human fraternity document, or whether it's the Abrahamic house that is actually under construction as we speak, these are things we have to show the rest of the world to prove to them that Islam is inherently not a violent religion. And there are those of us who practice it and preach it every single day in a very civilized way.
Thank you. Let me ask you a little bit more about the Abrahamic Family House project, because I don't think everyone on the line necessarily understands it. It's a mosque, a synagogue, a church. They all share a very similar space. because we as an embassy and us who are working here in the UAE and me personally, like we see the vision of this, and we see the promise of it to really knit together the different faith communities and encourage interfaith dialogue, fostering tolerance. So not only does Canada actually have a deep expertise in the interfaith space, but one of our greatest Canadian companies, is actually designing the Visitor Welcome Center at the Abrahamic Family House. So I would really love to hear your views about how the UAE really plans to leverage their investments in things like kosher kitchens and inspired spaces like Abrahamic Family House, and how you're going to use that to welcome more visitors, including the Jewish community coming to visit the UAE.
So I was watching a panel a couple of weeks ago, and someone made the comment that, Israelis grow up, just like Egyptians, like I was saying, Egyptians grow up thinking Israel is the adversary. Israelis grow up thinking all Arabs hate them. Now, I totally understand why some of them would think that, but when you introduce mandatory kosher food and certification of kosher food, I think that sends the exact opposite message. I think Israelis and Jews now understand that our attitude towards them is very different. And I think, the Abrahamic House is just one of those things. By the way, the Abrahamic House was not, a grand strategy that we came up with, many years ago. It was something that was a natural consequence to the Pope's visit. After the Pope visit and his meeting with the Imam of Al-Azhar and the signing of the Human Fraternity document, it became sort of like a natural consequence of the visit. And of course, if you're welcoming all religions, why aren't you welcoming their traditions, like kosher food? Why aren't you welcoming their values and their heritage? So it's not a far stretch, and we don't have a plan to leverage them, but what we're trying to show the world is Islam is not the problem. Everyone is welcome here. Everyone is welcome here as long as you're respectful and you play by the rules. And I think that is a really important message to send out of the Middle East, especially these days.
Thank you. And my final question, Beth, so that you know, and Ambassador Al-Otaiba, I want to come back to the War and Peace, and I'm going to ask you a similar question that Monsieur Charret asked you, but I'm going to ask in a little different way. War and Peace is characterized by those strong people-to-people linkages. And as Canadians, we actually see ourselves a lot in the Abraham Accords. We share the values of the Abraham Accords. I wouldn't be doing my job if I didn't do a little sell job here. We are the third largest Jewish diaspora in the world, a strong and established Jewish community. We also have a significant engaged Arab diaspora. In UAE, for example, every single Lebanese person I meet is a Lebanese Canadian or a Palestinian Canadian. So we have these very, very powerful, impactful diaspora communities. We have, in addition, 40,000 Canadians living in the UAE, 3 dynamic resident business councils, thousands of Canadians who have made Aliyah to Israel that are in positions of leadership, including the Knesset. And quite honestly, we make the best darn bagels in the whole world. And I will
I think she has an issue with the Salat again.
Salat is blocking her. The last thing I heard was the best darn bagels in the world.
Exactly, that's the same here. Beth?
So I feel like this question, unfortunately, was going in a really wonderful direction, but she might sign in, but if she, there she is.
I was about to get a question on I was going to get a question on bagels, which would have been the easiest question I would have had.
Do me a favor, Beth, just give him my phone number.
Well, I worry we're not going to get a question about bagels, and
Give him phone number.
And Ambassador Grossman may have trouble coming back. So maybe what we could do is I'll pivot to one more question if you have a couple more minutes.
Sure.
Oh, Ambassador Grossman, are you back?
Frozen again.
I think she may have some trouble. We've seen so many developments arising out of this agreement already. I opened the newspaper today. We saw 6 new announcements about different things that are happening around flights that are going back and forth. I think 28 flights per week.
Airport.
Yes, that's right. Kosher kitchens, all of these sorts of things. Things are happening very quickly and are really exciting. I was wondering if you could talk for a few minutes about where you see this agreement going in 5 to 10 years from now and what you expect to be the developments.
I expect us on technical issues like entrepreneurship, technology, and startups, on things like AI, on things like food security, on things like desalination, health sciences. I think this is going to basically take what was very dynamic and fast-moving energies and just turbocharge them. You know, imagine all the know-how and expertise that exists in both countries that can now be shared with each other in order to find a, COVID vaccine or the new generation of desalination technology, right? It's like bringing Messi and Ronaldo, right, and putting them on the same team. So on the technical side, I expect a lot of progress and a lot of very fast progress. On the political side, we're going to have, like I said, some things that we agree on, the assessments of the region and trends. There is going to be some stuff that we disagree on. The Palestinian issue, just like Egypt and Jordan have very tough conversations with Israel about Palestine, or like Sweden and Norway have very tough conversations about it, we will also have tough conversations about it. I don't want people to think that the Abraham Accords means a blank check to the Palestinian issue. It doesn't. It means we are now able to speak with them. And on the cultural side, I think that's going to move no matter what, because I thought it was moving before the Abraham Accords. It's going to move even faster after the Abraham Accords. But the Accords will actually give it the context that many people didn't see before. They're saying, well, how can you have an Abrahamic house and welcome, Jews from around the world, but why don't you have a relationship with Israel? So now we have both. Now we have Israelis can now be able to visit the Abrahamic house once it's completed. And so, we're kind of just putting our money where our mouth is. We're saying we are open. We are open for cultural and tolerance and inclusion reasons, but we're also open for business reasons and we're open for political reasons.
Thank you so much. Ambassador Grossman, are you back and connected? I think everyone is waiting with bated breath about where the bagel question is going to unfold from here.
Thank you very much. I'm back. I'm hopefully here for the duration. I'm mortified, but I'm back. So you didn't hear the bagel question?
It stopped right after bagels. I got us very excited and hungry.
Goodness.
And then it froze.
Do you think I should just move to my conclusion?
Whatever you want.
I was just going to ask you about, just looking at the, the significant Jewish and Muslim citizenry that we have, the diversity as our strength. If Canada is known as peacekeepers around the world, where do you see a possible potential role for Canada outside of the economic, thinking about government, civil society? We are interfaith dialogue experts. We are good people. Where do you think that you might see us fitting into anything that you have planned in the future?
I think in general, I don't have any specific plans or any, agendas, but I think what we need to be better, more effective at is, the moderates tend to be the quiet ones. The extreme voices tend to be the loudest voices. By the way, it's everywhere. It's not just in the region. It's in the West. It's in the East. It's, the people who have the most followers tends to be the most radical views and the most radical voices. So I think as moderates, as peacekeepers, as people who have very similar values between the UAE, Canada, I think we need to speak up a little more. I think we need to call out hate speech. I think we need to call out ideologies that we don't believe in. I think there's a lot of people who get away with a lot of things that shouldn't get away with it, to be frank. And we just need to kind of speak with one voice when it comes to very simple things like hate speech and extremism and radicalization and misinterpretation of a religion that is ultimately not violent. I mean, I grew up in a house where it was a sort of a middle-class, middle-income home in Egypt, but I was taught to pray, but I was never taught that if I don't pray, something bad will happen, right? It was never a threat. I was encouraged to fast during Ramadan, but when I was ready to. It wasn't like, oh, if you don't fast when you're 15, you're going to hell, right? It's how you're raised, it's how you're taught. And I think that in today's world, in a world where you have, the Hezbollahs and the Al-Qaedas and the ISISs of the world, we need to be more effective at speaking up for what we believe in.
Thank you. In closing, and on a very personal note, I would just like to thank you, Ambassador Al-Otaiba, the UAE, and even my own country for making one of my lifelong dreams come true. This particular webinar is not exactly the highlight, but in general, my lifelong dreams. I mean, it is, but of course, But seriously, I joined the Foreign Service 20 years ago with a vision to one day be in a role where I could represent my country and contribute to peace in the Middle East. And I really, truly believe that I was chosen by a higher power. Some would call it headquarters. I'm calling it a higher power to really come here and be here right at this very moment to realize my life's work. And I couldn't be more proud to be a Jewish Canadian woman representing my country and being part of UAE history. So thank you very much. Shukran to all of my Canadians out there who are allowing me to represent them here in the UAE. Please don't think I'm a Luddite. I usually do have very good technology going, and apologize if I've embarrassed you on the world stage, but thank you. Back to you, Beth, and thank you again, Ambassador Al-Otaiba.
My pleasure.
Thank you, Ambassador Grossman. I think that aside from the technology piece, you really summed that up really beautifully. So thank you for joining us here today. That actually brings us to the end of our session. I can't believe how quickly the hour went. There's just so much to talk about and so much opportunity coming from this agreement. And Ambassador Al-Otaiba, we are incredibly honored and thankful for you joining us here today. I think you've done an excellent job of outlining that these circumstances really will present opportunities not only for those in the region, but around the world, including for countries like Canada. So a shout out to all of the companies and individuals who are on the line today. As you consider these opportunities and how you may apply these to your business or to yourself personally, please know that there are a number of resources to support you as you consider your next steps. The CUBC and the other Canada-UAE business councils, as well as the UAE and Canadian consulates and embassies and the Trade Commissioner Service, are all there to support you as you think about the possibilities within the UAE and the region. Please feel free to reach out to us. On behalf of the CUBC co-chairs and councils and all of our supporting partners, I would like to end by thanking again His Excellency Al-Otaiba for showing us that even through these very challenging times, there is a reason for hope. To all of our wonderful speakers, to our special guests, and of course to all of you joining us today, a sincere thank you. It has been a true pleasure to connect with you, and we look forward to keeping in touch. Thank you, everyone, and have a wonderful day.